In 1932, a city plumber named Thomas McCarthy descended into Sacramento's underground on what should have been a routine repair job. He never came back up the same way. What he documented in his journal over those 3 days under the city streets would sit in a family attic for 80 years, forgotten, until his great-grandson found it. The journal described entire buildings, storefronts with glass still in the windows, sidewalks that once saw sunlight, and something McCarthy called the marble hall that he said ran for 3 city blocks underground. Sacramento buried an entire city beneath its streets in the 1860s. The official story says it was about flooding, raise the street level, solve the problem. But McCarthy's journal suggests they buried something else, something that didn't fit the timeline. If you're watching this video, subscribe right now. Because what comes next is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about how cities are built. Hit that button. You'll want to see where this goes. Sacramento in 1850 looked nothing like the city that exists today. It sat at the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers, a natural floodplain that turned into a disaster zone every winter. Merchants built their stores on wooden platforms. Houses sat on stilts. The entire downtown flooded so regularly that residents kept boats tied to their porches like most people park cars. By 1852, the city had flooded 6 times. Business owners were losing inventory. People were dying. The solution seemed obvious. Raise the ground level, build the city higher. The project started in 1864. The plan was to raise the streets by anywhere from 10 to 15 feet, depending on the block. Property owners would be responsible for raising their own buildings. Some did, most didn't. And that's where the official story gets strange. Instead of waiting for building owners to comply, the city just started filling in the streets. They brought in dirt by the wagon load, covered the old ground level, created new streets on top of the old ones. And anyone who didn't raise their building in time found themselves with a ground floor that was now a basement. The standard historical narrative stops there. Old ground floor became new basement. Move on, nothing to see. Thomas McCarthy's journal tells a different story. McCarthy was 34 years old in 1932. He'd worked for the Sacramento Water Department for 12 years. His job involved maintaining the underground pipe systems that ran beneath the city streets, systems that accessed spaces most people didn't know existed. On September 14, 1932, McCarthy received a work order for a pipe rupture beneath K Street between 6th and 7th. Standard repair. He'd done hundreds of them. He climbed down a maintenance access with his toolbox and a handheld lantern. His supervisor noted the time as 9:47 a.m. McCarthy didn't report back until September 17th at 6:23 p.m., 3 days later. His great-grandson, David McCarthy, found the journal in Tuanapee while cleaning out his grandfather's estate in Roseville. The leather-bound notebook had been stored in a metal box along with old family photographs and Thomas's plumbing certification from 1920. David didn't think much of it at first. He assumed it was a work log. But when he started reading the entries dated September 14th through 1932, he realized his great-grandfather had documented something nobody was supposed to see. The journal is 47 pages, written in pencil, some sections water damaged but mostly legible. David had it professionally scanned and preserved. He shared copies with 3 local historians in 2013. 2 dismissed it as fiction. The 3rd started investigating. The first entry, dated September 14, 9:52 a.m., starts normally. McCarthy describes finding the pipe rupture right where the work order indicated. Minor leak, easy fix. But then he writes about hearing something. Heard what sounded like wind through a tunnel. But there's no wind down here. Followed the sound east along the old K Street level. Found a brick wall that had partially collapsed, gap about 3 feet wide. Looked through with the lantern. Can't believe what I'm seeing. McCarthy describes walking through that gap into what he calls Old Sacramento proper. Not a basement, not a crawl space, a street, with buildings on both sides, wooden awnings still attached, glass windows intact. He writes about walking for 30 minutes in a straight line, lantern held up, seeing storefront after storefront, some with signs still visible. Cohen and Sons Dry Goods, Western Telegraph Office, the Golden Eagle Saloon. What struck McCarthy most wasn't just that these buildings existed underground, it was their condition. He describes the wooden awnings as barely weathered, like they were built last year, not 70 years ago. The glass windows weren't shattered or covered in decades of grime. They were intact, clear enough that he could see through them into the dark interiors. He tried the door to one storefront, locked, but through the window he could make out shelves still lined with goods, bottles, tins, items arranged as if the shopkeeper had just stepped out for lunch and never came back. McCarthy's training as a plumber made him observant about details most people wouldn't notice. He writes about the street itself. Cobblestones, not the rough gravel or packed dirt you'd expect from a frontier town. Carefully laid cobblestones in a herringbone pattern, the kind of skilled work that takes time and expertise. He mentions the air quality, expected it to be stale, suffocating, but he describes it as surprisingly breathable, like there's ventilation from somewhere I can't see. That detail alone raises questions. How could air circulate through sealed underground spaces that had been buried for 70 years? The detail in McCarthy's descriptions matches architectural styles from the 1860s, Italianate facades, decorative cornices, the kind of craftsmanship you see in photographs from Gold Rush-era California. Sacramento's official history acknowledges that some of the old ground level was preserved when the streets were raised. They turned portions of it into the Sacramento Underground tours in the 1960s. Tourists can walk through a few blocks of old storefronts beneath current buildings. The city treats it like a curiosity, a quirky footnote. McCarthy's journal describes something much larger. He estimated he walked through underground passages that extended for at least 12 city blocks, and the structures he documented weren't the rough wooden buildings you'd expect from a frontier town. September the 15th, morning entry. McCarthy writes about finding what he calls the Marble Hall. He describes a corridor about 20 feet wide with polished marble floors and columns, not wood, not brick, marble. He says the ceiling was vaulted, maybe 15 feet high, with decorative plasterwork that reminded him of government buildings. The journal includes a rough sketch. McCarthy wasn't an artist, but you can see what he's trying to convey. A grand hallway, classical architecture, nothing you'd associate with 1860s Sacramento. McCarthy spent nearly an hour in the marble hall, running his hands along the walls, tapping the columns to verify they were solid marble and not just painted plaster. He writes about the acoustics, how his footsteps echoed in a way that suggested the space extended far beyond what his lantern could illuminate. The plasterwork on the ceiling depicted scenes he couldn't fully make out in the dim light. Figures in robes, geometric patterns, something that looked like celestial bodies or maps. He mentions trying to sketch one section but giving up because the detail was too fine for his pencil to capture. What bothered McCarthy most was the question of labour. He'd worked construction before becoming a plumber. He knew what it took to quarry marble, transport it, cut it, polish it, and install it. The marble hall he stood in would have required dozens of skilled craftsmen working for months, maybe years. And they did all this underground in Sacramento in the 1850s or 1860s, when the city barely had paved streets on the surface. He writes, "This doesn't make sense. The timeline doesn't work, unless this wasn't built by the people we think built Sacramento, unless it was already here." This is where the Tartaria connection enters the conversation. For those unfamiliar, Tartaria refers to a theory that a technologically advanced civilization existed in the 19th century across much of Asia, Europe, and North America. This civilization, according to researchers, built structures using techniques and architectural knowledge that shouldn't have existed in that time period. Then something happened. A reset, mud flood, catastrophe. The civilization was buried, literally and figuratively, and a new historical narrative was written over the top. Sacramento's underground has always been presented as a practical solution to a flooding problem. But researchers have pointed to inconsistencies. Why would a frontier city in the 1850s have the engineering knowledge and resources to execute such a massive undertaking? Why does so much of the preserved underground architecture look more sophisticated than surface structures from the same supposed time period? McCarthy's description of the Marble Hall doesn't fit Gold Rush Sacramento. Marble was expensive. Transporting it to California in the 1850s would have been difficult and costly. Why would anyone build an underground corridor with marble floors in a city that was supposedly struggling with basic infrastructure? The journal's September 15th afternoon entry gets stranger. McCarthy describes finding a staircase that descended even deeper. He writes that he hesitated. His job was to fix pipes, not explore, but curiosity won. Stairs go down maybe 30 feet, different construction, stone blocks, not brick. At the bottom, another level, bigger spaces, what looks like it was a market or public square. Can still see fountain in the center, dry now. Buildings around the perimeter, 3 stories, windows with iron grillwork. This can't be right. This is too big, too old. McCarthy estimated this lower level sat about 40 feet below the current street surface. That's well below what the official raising of Sacramento would account for. The city raised streets by 10 to 15 feet, maybe 20 in some spots, not 40. He spent hours on this lower level documenting what he saw. His descriptions mention architectural details that match Beaux-Arts style. Ornamental ironwork, arched doorways, stone masonry that looks machine cut, not hand hewn. The fountain in the center of the square fascinated him. He describes it as octagonal, about 12 feet across, made of the same stone as the surrounding buildings. It had 3 tiers, and he could see where water had once flowed from one level to the next. But what caught his attention were the carvings around the base. Faces. Not European faces, he notes, features that looked Eastern European or possibly Central Asian. McCarthy walked the perimeter of this underground square, counted the buildings, 19 structures ranging from 2 to 4 stories tall. Each one had windows with intact glass on the lower floors. Higher floors were too dark to see clearly, but he could make out balconies with iron railings that showed the same ornate craftsmanship as the fountain. One building had double doors 10 feet tall, made of wood that McCarthy describes as dark, heavy, and barely showing any rot despite being underground for who knows how long. The doors were locked, but through a window beside them he could see what looked like a grand staircase inside, marble steps leading up into darkness. He writes about the feeling of the place. Not creepy or haunted like you might expect from an abandoned underground space. Just empty, preserved, like a city frozen in time waiting for its residents to return. Then he found the inscriptions. September 16th, morning. McCarthy writes about discovering carved symbols on several building facades at the lower level. He describes them as not English, not Spanish, maybe Russian or something Eastern European. He attempted to copy some of them into his journal. The symbols David McCarthy found in his great-grandfather's journal were photographed and shared online in 2014. Several researchers identified them as Cyrillic script, but the words didn't make sense. They appeared to be fragments, partial names, possibly dates. One researcher, a linguist who spoke Russian, suggested the characters might be Old Church Slavonic, a liturgical language that predates modern Russian. But that raised more questions than it answered. Why would Old Church Slavonic inscriptions be carved into buildings buried beneath Sacramento, California? Thomas McCarthy's journal describes finding these inscriptions on at least 7 different buildings. Some were carved into stone lintels above doorways. Others appeared on corner plaques, the kind you'd see marking important civic buildings. He copied down 5 distinct inscriptions, noting their locations as best he could. One inscription he recorded translates roughly to Hall of the Masters, Year of Foundation. But the year number didn't match any calendar system the linguist recognized. Another appeared to be a dedication, mentioning the great work and preservation of knowledge. McCarthy also mentions finding symbols that weren't Cyrillic at all, geometric patterns, circles within squares, triangles with specific angle measurements noted beside them. He writes, "These look like engineering diagrams or maybe astronomical charts, too precise to be decoration." What troubled David when he first saw these inscriptions was their placement. They weren't hidden or obscure. They were prominently displayed on building facades meant to be seen and read. These weren't secret markings, they were public declarations, which means whoever built these structures expected people to understand what they said. McCarthy's journal doesn't provide answers. He documents what he sees, describes it as best he can, questions his own sanity multiple times. Am I seeing this right? Has this always been here? Why doesn't anyone talk about this? The September 16th evening entry describes McCarthy trying to find his way back. He'd gone deeper than intended, got turned around in the underground passages. His lantern was running low on oil. He mentions panic setting in. Followed what I thought was the way back, ended up in a dead end. Brick wall, newer construction, maybe 10 or 15 years old. Someone sealed this passage off. Why? Tried another route, found collapsed section. Timbers and rubble blocking the way, starting to worry I won't get out. McCarthy eventually found a maintenance tunnel that led back to the modern water pipe system. He emerged on September 17th through a different access point than he'd entered, about 4 blocks from where he started. His supervisor reprimanded him for the 3-day absence. McCarthy told him he'd gotten lost in the underground maze while tracking the pipe issue. The official report lists the incident as employee found after being trapped in utility tunnels due to collapsed passage. Nothing about what McCarthy saw, nothing about the structures he documented. David McCarthy tried to verify his great-grandfather's account. He contacted the Sacramento Public Works Department in 2013, asked if there were maps of the underground areas beneath the city. They sent him schematics of utility tunnels and the known underground tour sections, nothing that matched the scale Thomas described. He reached out to the Sacramento History Museum. They acknowledged that yes, portions of old Sacramento were preserved underground, but characterized it as isolated pockets beneath individual buildings. Not connected passages, not multiple levels, certainly not anything extending 12 blocks. One museum curator told David that stories about extensive underground cities beneath Sacramento were urban legends. People loved mysterious narratives, but the reality was far more mundane. Some old storefronts got covered up when streets were raised, that's it. David wasn't satisfied. He started researching historical records from the 1860s, found something interesting. In 1866, the Sacramento Daily Union published a brief article about construction workers discovering unexpected voids beneath K Street during the street raising project. The workers reported finding structures of unknown origin that predated the earliest known settlement of the area. The article is 2 paragraphs. It mentions that city officials inspected the site, determined there was no safety concern, and ordered the voids filled in. No follow-up articles, no further mention. David also found property records from the 1870s that show several downtown buildings listed with sub-basement levels not accessible. Not basements, sub-basements, plural levels below ground, but there's no explanation of what those spaces were or why they weren't accessible. The Sacramento Archives has a collection of photographs from the 1860s street raising project. Most show dirt being hauled in, streets under construction, standard historical documentation. But there's one photograph dated 1867 that shows workers standing in what appears to be a large underground chamber. Stone walls, arched ceiling. The photo quality is poor, but you can make out details that suggest something more substantial than a simple cellar. The photograph's caption reads, "Workers in old foundation space, K Street." That's it. No context, no explanation of whose foundation it was or why it was so large. David found another document that the museum hadn't mentioned, a letter from 1868 written by the Sacramento city engineer to the mayor. The letter discusses complications arising from the discovery of pre-existing structures beneath proposed street elevations. The engineer recommends sealing and bypassing rather than excavation and removal due to structural concerns and budgetary constraints. The letter suggests the city knew they were building over something, and they made a conscious decision to cover it up rather than investigate it properly. David also discovered insurance records from the 1870s that list several downtown properties as having inaccessible lower levels of uncertain origin. Insurance companies charged higher premiums for these properties, citing unknown structural liabilities. But the properties sold anyway, and over time the paperwork about those lower levels disappeared from public records. David contacted engineers who specialize in urban archaeology, showed them his great-grandfather's journal and the research he'd compiled. Most were skeptical, one was intrigued. Dr. Ellen Morrison, a structural engineer who'd worked on subway projects in Boston and New York, reviewed McCarthy's descriptions. She pointed out that his accounts of the marble hall and the lower-level architecture didn't sound like makeshift frontier construction. The materials, the scale, the engineering required to create stable underground spaces that large would have demanded sophisticated knowledge. If what's described in this journal is accurate, Morrison said in an interview David recorded, then someone built those spaces with permanence in mind. That's not flood mitigation. That's intentional architecture. And if it predates Sacramento's known settlement history, then we have to ask who built it and why. The Tartaria theory suggests a possible answer, a pre-existing civilization with advanced architectural capabilities, structures that got buried during a cataclysmic event, possibly a mud flood. Then later, settlers moved in, built on top, and created a new historical narrative that fit their understanding. Sacramento's location supports this. The city sits on deep alluvial soil deposits, evidence of massive prehistoric flooding. Some geologists suggest the area experienced catastrophic flood events in the centuries before European settlement, events that could have buried existing structures under layers of sediment. Native American oral histories from the region mention the time when the water covered everything, and the old ones who lived in the stone houses before us. These stories are typically dismissed as myth or metaphor, but what if they're describing something real? McCarthy's journal includes one entry that stands out. September 16th, late evening. He writes about finding a room in the lower level that contained what looked like machinery. He describes metal components, gears, something that reminded him of a printing press, but more complex. He didn't understand what it was, didn't touch it, just documented it and moved on. If they had machines down here, who was operating them? And why hide them underground? Unless they weren't hidden, unless this was ground level once and something buried it. McCarthy's description of the machinery room is surprisingly detailed for someone who claims he just documented it and moved on. He spent at least 30 minutes in that room sketching the equipment, trying to understand its purpose. The main apparatus, as he describes it, consisted of a large wheel about 6 feet in diameter, made of brass or bronze. The wheel had grooves cut into its edge at precise intervals. Connected to the wheel was a series of smaller gears descending in size, all interlocking in a way that suggested complex mechanical advantage. What puzzled McCarthy was the absence of any obvious power source. No steam engine, no water wheel connection, no crank or lever that would allow human operation. He writes, "The whole thing looks designed to be driven by something, but I can't figure out what. There's a shaft extending from the main wheel down into the floor, disappearing into what looks like solid stone." He also mentions finding tools in the room. Not primitive hand tools, precision instruments, calipers, measuring devices with markings in a system he didn't recognize. Something that looked like an optical lens set in a brass housing. He picked up one tool, describes it as heavy, perfectly balanced, with a level of craftsmanship I've never seen in any modern tool. The room contained shelving along one wall. Empty now, but McCarthy could see dust patterns suggesting objects had been stored there systematically, removed at some point before the space was sealed off. The question of how Sacramento could execute such a massive street-raising project in the 1860s deserves examination. The city's population in 1860 was around 13,000 people. The project supposedly took decades and involved raising hundreds of city blocks. That's an enormous undertaking for a young city with limited resources and technology. Historical records show the street raising happened in phases. Some blocks got completed in the 1860s, others not until the 1870s or 1880s. But the engineering coordination required, the excavation, the fill material, the structural work, it would have demanded expertise that shouldn't have been readily available in Gold Rush, California, unless they weren't building from scratch, unless they were covering up something that already existed. David McCarthy's research led him to other cities with similar histories. Seattle raised its streets after a fire in 1889. Chicago did the same in the 1850s. Multiple American cities have underground sections that are explained as old street levels that got buried when cities decided to build higher. The pattern is consistent. Catastrophe or flooding provides justification. Streets get raised. Old ground level becomes underground. Official history moves forward. Questions about what existed before get dismissed. David tried to organize an independent survey of Sacramento's underground in 2015. He contacted ground-penetrating radar companies, got quotes for scanning beneath downtown blocks. The project would have cost about $40,000. He started a crowdfunding campaign. It failed to reach its goal. He then approached the Sacramento City Council about getting permission for a limited exploration of the utility tunnels described in his great-grandfather's journal. The request was denied. City officials cited safety concerns and liability issues. They said the tunnels were structurally unsound and not suitable for public access. David pushed back, asked why, if the tunnels were so dangerous, they weren't properly mapped and secured. No clear answer, just more citations of policy and procedure. In 2017, a water main broke on K Street, about 2 blocks from where Thomas McCarthy had originally descended in 1932. Repair crews had to excavate down to access the old pipe system. David showed up at the site, talked to the workers, asked what they were seeing down there. One worker, who didn't want to be named, told David they'd found weird stuff. Old brickwork that looked too fine for underground pipes. A sealed passage that kept echoing when they knocked on it. His supervisor told him to ignore it and focus on the pipe repair. They filled everything back in after the work was complete. Thomas McCarthy's journal ends with a September 17th entry written after he returned to the surface. He describes feeling disoriented, questioning what he'd seen, wondering if he should tell anyone. Who would believe it? I barely believe it myself. An entire city under the city, buildings that look older and better built than what's up here. I asked Frank, his supervisor, how much of the underground he'd seen. He said just the tunnel sections near the pipes. That's it. I asked if he'd ever heard stories about bigger spaces down there. He laughed, said there's urban legends, but that's all they are. McCarthy never filed an official report about what he found, never told his family the full story, just wrote it in his journal and put it away. David asked his grandfather, Thomas's son, if he remembered his father talking about the underground. The grandfather, who died in 2014, told David that Thomas used to say Sacramento had secrets, that the city's official history left things out. But he never gave specifics, just vague comments that the family assumed were old man rambling. The journal sat in that attic for 80 years. A first-hand account from a city employee who stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to see. And then, like so many other pieces of evidence that don't fit the narrative, it got filed away and forgotten, until someone found it and started asking questions. The Sacramento Underground tours that operate today show visitors a sanitized version of the city's buried past. You walk through restored storefronts, see old foundations. The guides tell you about the flood problems and the clever engineering solution of raising the streets. It's educational, it's safe, it's controlled. What the tours don't show is the extent of what might still be down there. The sealed passages, the deeper levels, the architecture that doesn't match the timeline. David McCarthy still has his great-grandfather's journal. He's made the scans available online. Researchers can examine them, draw their own conclusions. But without access to the underground itself, without proper surveying and documentation, the questions remain unanswered. Why would Sacramento have marble halls underground? Where did the materials come from? Who had the skill to build at that scale? And why does the official history gloss over evidence that suggests something more complex than a simple flood mitigation project? The Tartaria theory proposes that we've been lied to about our recent past, that the 19th century wasn't what we've been taught, that advanced civilizations existed, built incredible structures, and then disappeared from the historical record. Their buildings were buried, repurposed, or demolished. New construction happened on top, and a simplified narrative was created that fit the new power structure's needs. Sacramento's underground could be evidence of that, or it could be exactly what the historians say it is, a quirky side effect of 1860s urban planning. Thomas McCarthy's journal doesn't prove anything definitively, but it asks the right questions, questions that deserve better answers than urban legend or structural concerns. What's under Sacramento? Not just the parts they let tourists see. The sealed sections, the collapsed tunnels, the spaces that sit 40 feet below current street level in areas that were supposedly only raised by 15 feet. Someone knows, someone has the maps, someone made the decision to fill in certain passages and restrict access to others, and whoever that someone is, they're not talking. McCarthy ended his journal with a single line that David found chilling. I think I found something they didn't want found, and I think I understand now why they buried it. Sacramento still floods occasionally. Just this past winter, heavy rains caused issues in Old Sacramento. The tourist area, water seeped up from below through cracks in the modern construction. Businesses had to shut down for a few days while crews pumped out the water. Where did that water come from? The underground, the buried city, the spaces that officially don't exist in the scale that McCarthy described. David McCarthy continues researching. He's connected with other people who have stories about Sacramento's underground. Former city workers who've seen things, historians who found documents that raise questions, engineers who've noticed oddities in the city's foundation structures. None of them have the smoking gun. None of them can prove the Tartaria theory or definitively show that Sacramento is hiding something massive beneath its streets. But the evidence keeps accumulating. Small pieces, fragments, journal entries from a plumber who went somewhere he wasn't supposed to go. The marble hall is still down there. If McCarthy's journal is accurate, it's beneath K Street, somewhere between 6th and 12th, 40 feet below the surface, sealed off, waiting for someone with the authority and resources to actually investigate, to map it, to document it, to ask the questions that the official narrative has spent 160 years avoiding. Until that happens, Thomas McCarthy's journal remains what it is, a fascinating historical document, an unsettling account from a credible source, and a reminder that sometimes the most interesting parts of history are the ones we've buried. If this video made you question the official story, good, that's the point. Hit subscribe if you want more content that challenges accepted narratives. And if you know someone who's worked in Sacramento's underground, someone who's seen things that don't match the tour guide version, reach out. These stories need to be told. The last plumber who walked the buried levels of Sacramento wrote about what he found. We owe it to him to take those words seriously. And we owe it to ourselves to demand answers about what's really under our cities. Because if Sacramento is hiding something this big, what about Seattle? What about Chicago? What about all the other cities that raised their streets and buried their pasts? The truth is, down there, 40 feet below K Street, waiting for someone brave enough to go look,